Welcome everybody to a Rural Policy Learning Commons webinar. Today's webinar is brought to you by the University of Highlands and Islands of Inverness College in Scotland and the RPLC migration team. Today's moderator is Philomena de Lima, and I'll pass it over to her to introduce our session.
Hello everybody, good morning. I know it's morning time with you, it's afternoon with us in Scotland. And yes, as Michael has said, I'm Philomena de Lima and I'm the theme lead for migration and Rural Policy Learning Commons migration theme lead, if you like, a mouthful there. And I'd like to introduce Dr. David Radford, who happens to be from the University of South Australia and happened to be up in Scotland, and I decided that I would take the opportunity and ask David to do this webinar because I know that there is a general interest in Canada as well as in Europe on sort of issues around migration, but particularly refugees and refugees coming to rural areas, which is a new experience for some communities anyway. So I know that David's interests are more than just refugees, but he has been working on refugees recently, and I thought it would be really interesting to connect up what's happening in Australia with everybody else's interests here. So you already have David's biography in front of you, and well, I would just like to welcome David. I've only met him 2 hours ago, and he certainly will have some very interesting things to say. And the idea is that he will present for 30 minutes, and then but you can type your Q&As in the Q&A box, and I will keep an eye on it, and when David finishes, then we will open it up to questions. So thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Michael, is that right?
You just pushed unmute on your microphone, so I was just turning your microphone back on. So I missed your question. You need to press the share screen?
Yeah, we need to press, I know it's always a struggle trying to remember what one is. Yeah, full screen.
Yeah.
And the PowerPoint.
Okay.
There you go, that looks great. And just push slideshow. You're in the right area there. Up, 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 up.
I know. View.
Yeah, that works.
Ready to go.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, it's terrific to be able to join you in Canada. So we've kind of got a 3-continent shift here from Australia to Scotland to Canada. I'm on a completely other time zone at the moment, somewhere around midnight or early morning in Australia. But it's look, it's terrific to be with you and to share a little bit about some of the experiences that some rural areas in Australia are experiencing at the moment, particularly around increasing diversity within rural communities. And that's taking place in a number of different ways. My particular interest has been around a non-European migration into rural towns. So what I'm going to do is I'll give a little bit of a background to what's been happening in Australia, and then I will begin to speak from a particular case study that I've been engaged with in a country town, particularly around a framework for understanding the challenges of non-European refugee migration into rural towns around what's come to be called everyday multiculturalism. The lived experience, the intercultural dynamics between long-term, what I refer to as long-term rural residents and migrants. So, and then we'll kind of bring it together with some ideas around how we can bridge some of those differences in rural communities, and the way I've been able to see that in this particular rural community that I'll be looking at. Just as a little background, Australia has gone through a number of different migration phases, particularly over the last 100 years. But in the last 20 years or so, there has been a particular movement to see, for the Australian government to direct policies, have policies directed towards migrants moving into rural areas. This is both because of labour shortages and population issues, where increasing numbers of rural residents are moving into bigger towns and cities, and issues of economic viability for these communities. And so governments have been interested in Australia to see how they can see more migrants move in. Programs such as the State-Specific Regional Migration Scheme, where they particularly allocate particular areas where humanitarian migrants move, refugees. In the state of South Australia, where I'm involved with, the capital city is considered rural or regional, but certainly there are particular towns that the government designate where they would like to see refugees and humanitarian migrants move to. The particular town, that a case study that I will look at, is not one of those designated towns. This is a town where kind of migration has happened organically. But in a nearby larger town, there are a mixture of humanitarian migrants, including Karen and Congolese, Karen from Myanmar, Congolese, and a smattering of other groups. And it seems that some of the recently received Syrian refugees will be moving to that particular town. One of the things that is true is that migration and ethnicity are reshaping some rural areas. Older Anglo-Celtic and indigenous inhabitants of regional towns and other European migrants, particularly post-World War II, now live alongside those from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And this has become quite a challenge for some regional communities. This is a particular, this picture is of an Afghan Hazara family, which is a community that I've particularly focused on in this country town, and where this kind of non-European migration is sometimes referred to as visible migrants. And visible in country towns, whether because of skin color, dress, religious practice, features which make them stand out far more than previous European migrants coming, non-Anglo-Saxon migrants coming into some Australian towns. And of course, the factors associated with Afghan Hazara are not just the fact that they look different, but because of religious factors as well. And certainly the diversity, religious diversity in these communities has largely been between Christian denominations or those without religious background. Factors associated with a successful migrant settlement. Key has been issues, the local council definitely, the mayor and local councils, the support and positive encouragement to welcome diverse groups in the community has been really important. In this particular local town, the previous mayor was quite opposed to new migrants, whereas the present mayor is open to the kind of diversity that they're seeing. And that diversity includes not just these Afghan Hazara, but other skilled or temporary migration, Filipino, Korean, amongst other particular groups. But certainly the Hazara Afghan are the largest group. Community partnerships have been really important. Vibrant volunteers, a network have been important. Processes within the community for engaging with refugees. And there is an Australian Migrant Resource Centre which has more recently been set up to help provide resources, particularly for refugee humanitarian migrants in the community. Affordable housing, employment opportunities, and in country towns, particularly around the area that I've been looking at, employment has been an important element for why a number have moved into this rural community. It's an agricultural community. And there have been a number of certainly temporary work opportunities in the agricultural sector, which I'll look at briefly. Perhaps more, my particular focus is around social inclusion factors. So if you were integration and the issue of building cohesion, social and cultural capital between different communities, how do you bridge difference because of culture, because of religion, because of what one has always known, in such a way that those coming into the community can feel at home or begin to feel to belong? And of course, issues of identity, the way rural communities see themselves, and the changes that are taking place and the challenges to what it means to be from those rural communities. Other issues include issues of rurality. In other words, the idea that rural communities are somehow particularly Australian rural communities, and this would be true in certainly some places in Europe. I can't speak for Canada, but traditionally kind of understood to be exclusively white national identity places. Certainly, there have been tensions around what it means to be Australian, and somehow ideas about some kind of homogenous Australian white Anglo-Saxon identity is epitomized in rural communities and in rural spaces. And with this ideas of otherness, who belongs, who doesn't belong, and marginalization. Issues of racism are certainly present. And in this particular community that I've been looking at, it's been present. It's certainly hard to say whether it's been widespread. I've certainly had one particular farmer tell me quite directly, and excuse the language, this place is shit because of the migrants. And directly, I'm a racist, this person said. I don't like them. I want them out of town. And the further he would pull down the drinks, he wanted to get those unpleasant people out of town. Keep Australian for Australians, apparently whatever Australians mean, of course. And there have been issues of labeling. The idea that refugees in particular, they are boat people, asylum seekers, and the association with illegal immigration. Somehow these people are jumping queues. And of course, issues for those who are from Muslim communities and the association with being terrorists and generalizations associated with these kinds of otherness. Along with that, in some rural communities have been these issues of inclusion and exclusion in local communities. This particular image that I have up on the PowerPoint is the country town, the town square, and the local pub, the local hotel, and the ways in which these particular spaces include or exclude particular people. And these are challenges that the Hazara Afghan refugees have faced. A couple of quick examples is groups of young men, and obviously most of the asylum seekers were men who came across. Of course, it's gendered, it's male. And in many cases, they were in situations where they were on what were called temporary bridging visas, which in some cases meant that they could have live in Australia with some government help, but were not allowed to work. Some were able to work, but certainly many of them could learn English, and that was about it. And there were tensions within this local country town about what were these men in groups doing, sitting in the town square, ogling the women as they walked by. And certainly this was the kind of rumor that was going around. And this certainly got back to the Hazara. And when I first were involved in my own research in the community, I observed Afghan men in the town square, but after some time, you just wouldn't see them at all. It became quite apparent for them that they were not welcome in the town square, and they were excluded. If not by some kind of law, there was some kind of social exclusion. The pub is another example where one person said to me, look, if you're a real Australian, you go to the pub, you drink alcohol, and you gamble. These Afghans, they don't do that. They don't drink and they don't gamble. And of course, the undercurrent with that idea is that somehow, if you're a real Australian, you drink and you gamble. If you don't drink and you don't gamble, does that mean you're not Australian? But certainly there was an exclusion that began to take place in relationship to the pub. From an identity perspective, of course, the pub has got a strong Australian identity connotation and what it means to be part of that. And the increasing diversity of these local communities raises questions. What does it mean to be a part of these communities? How can regional communities identify and develop capacities for intercultural understanding? And part of my emphasis in my own research is the fact that it's not just, it's the fact that both migrants, whether humanitarian or skilled migrants coming into communities, it's the responsibility of migrants to change and develop new forms of cultural competence as they come into their host communities. But it's also the responsibility of local communities to develop new capacities for interaction and identity transformation. And where both take place, there is a greater opportunity for communities to make these changes, I believe, successful. Pardee and Lee have argued, for instance, that increasing diverse communities living in the same physical location is not something to be accepted, rejected, or debated. Rather, it's a fact of life. And this is certainly true in these rural communities. Whether they like it or not, the fact is that this diversity is happening in increasing ways. Of course, the key is how they're going to respond to that. This particular local community that I've been looking at, as I mentioned, is quite a lot of agriculture. It has a meat works, which provides opportunity for some work. But particularly in this last 5 to 10 years, this increased migration of both humanitarian and skilled or temporary migration into the area. The Hazara, interestingly, humanitarian migrants, 300 to 600 have moved in the last 5 to 10 years. That's nearly a 5 to 10% increase in the population. The mayor told me that if it was not for their migration, the population would have declined in their community, and she had seen that as a really positive contribution. And as a side note, there is an economic contribution that these refugees are making into the community. There's been a recent study in Nil, in the state of Victoria. Nil is a country town. Deloitte's study that showed a group of 100 Burmese refugees who'd moved into this town in 5 years had a positive impact of over $40 million in the community. It's an interesting development. Part of my interest, as I mentioned, is around everyday multiculturalism. So it's not so much the policies that are imposed from above, but the way people live out everyday interactions, the way they negotiate and experience encounters. Encounters between long-term rural residents and these new migrants. When I think of otherness, it's also looking at the ways we identify others as somehow being different from ourselves, often but not always in opposition. It certainly can be a way, when we think of otherness, that divides communities, who is in and who is out. I've looked at something which I've called everyday otherness, and I've referred to that as the way people come to terms with and negotiate the conscious and unconscious differences that members of different communities feel, see, and experience, understand, and interpret when interacting with one another. We see difference in all kinds of different ways, and it's not always rational. It's not always a rational kind of idea that somebody is different. It's sometimes how we feel when we see and experience difference. And sometimes it's outright racism, and sometimes it's just people not really knowing how to deal with difference. And for some, it's fear. I want to look at a couple of examples here, trying to be a bit aware of time. When we're looking at everyday otherness, and the kind of fears that people have in the community. This is an example of an older person in this rural town. She said, you know, the older generation in the town are unsure. They don't like to have their culture questioned. The Hazara, she claims, these Afghans, they're not happy with Christmas celebrations. They can't expect to move from where they've come from and stay the same. The Afghans need to make an effort. They shouldn't tell us you can't sing hymns at Christmas. In fact, she claims some school classes have stopped putting Christmas decorations up, and our local shopping centre has stopped putting on Christmas carols. And she goes on to say, quite honestly, this offended me. So much so that I and a neighbour went down to the Woolworth shopping centre and said, where are the carols? They should not come in and tell us you can't play carols. They can't, they mustn't, but they are. Now, this is an interesting situation because this particular person was feeling that these new migrants were forcing or putting pressure on local authorities and the employers with the shopping centre to change their culture. And she was quite offended by this whole process. There's a lot of hearsay in rural communities. Words spread very quickly, whether somebody has actually experienced something or not. And of course, as we know, that stories change very quickly as they spread, and rural communities more so, particularly with the advent of social media, where rural communities have access to Facebook, and these things go up very quickly and spread. I was actually speaking with an Afghan Hazara Leader, and about his own experiences in the community, and without bringing up this other situation, he said he brought up the fact that there had been this problem with Christmas celebrations, and he said to me, interestingly, we certainly didn't want, he said, the celebrations to stop. We're not like that. We actually love Christmas. Our children really enjoy it, and so do the adults. In fact, we go and visit our friends. And for those of you who might be familiar with the cultures in Central Asia and South Asia, festivals are huge. They love to party and to eat and to be a part of it. And his question was, why do people feel like that? What are they thinking? Of course, they were not asked themselves about this particular situation. It was quite unfortunate. So how can we bridge difference? Amanda Wise talks about transversal practices in which groups, through exchange and gift giving, actually bridge across differences. And she refers to what she calls transversal enablers, these kinds of people who bridge difference between communities. I've, in some of my own recent research, have kind of noticed that there are really two kinds of these transversal enablers, these people who bridge across diversity. One I call structural transversal enablers, and these are people with some kind of paid or voluntary position in the community that allows them to actively support or positively influence intercultural dynamics between long-term residents and new migrant or refugee communities. So people like mayors in local councils, people who volunteer to teach English, they have some form of position in the community. I've also noticed that there are those who don't have any position necessarily, but in everyday kinds of ways, individuals find ways to positively influence these kind of dynamics. And this is where my particular interest is. Where do these interactions take place? On the street, in the shopping centre, at school, when the kids go to play soccer on the local team. Where are those places in which positive dynamics can take place on an individual level? I was talking with an example here is of a kindergarten principal who has really taken this idea really of a structural transversal enabler very seriously. And she says in her own little kindergarten, which had a mixture of long-term rural residents, Afghan kids, Filipino children, and people from other diverse communities. And she was saying, particularly the Hazara, what we're trying to do is to make them feel a part of the kindergarten as a whole, not just to come in and leave their kids and go away, but to actually come in and participate with the children in the community, because she knows that when the kids finish school, they will go on to primary school and onto the local high school. And if local families have been able to find ways to interact at this early stage, the chances are that they will already know them when they go on into primary school and high school, and hopefully be able to bridge across some of the differences that are there. And she's very intentionally acting on these. Aziz is a Hazara leader, and he interestingly has himself decided that he, without any kind of formal position or in terms of a paid position, he's certainly decided that it was important for him to help bridge his own Hazara community with the local community. He was one of the first Hazara into this country town. He came, found work in agriculture, and eventually over the years is now a contractor, bought a house in the community and is helping to find work. But he says, I volunteer myself. I go to work and it's really important to me. And then I get a call from other Hazara saying, Aziz, you've got to help me. And he's got to stop his work, wherever it is, to go and help them, whether it's with the doctor, the hospital. They ring him all over the place. In fact, it's not just the Hazara who ring him. The police call him up. Aziz, we need you. You know, there's been a problem. And he steps in. And these kinds of people are really important to bridge often cultural differences that are taking place. But one of the things that's key in this particular quote is the fact that he has begun to feel that he belongs to this rural community. He says, I'm proud to be a part of this. And it's really important to me when I'm in the street and the local person says to me, hi. And you know, they know me and I know them. And it's this bridging of difference that becomes really important. It also happens in everyday encounters. Fatima was a young Hazara, now a young Hazara mother in her early 20s. She was the first Hazara to go through this country, this rural high school. She spoke of her early experiences when she first went to school and hardly knew English. And she would wear a head covering, a hijab, and she had other kids in the school pulling the back of her hijab and calling her terrorist early on in her experience. But resilience is important because it's the ways in which, even when we have difficult encounters, we find ways to positively respond. And Fatima didn't take this offense personally, but actually went out of her way to keep reaching out to these young girls that were teasing her, so much so that by the time she was finishing school, some of these very girls that had teased her had become really good friends for her. Fatima is particularly a fantastic example because she's become a young leader, even if it's unofficial in the community, and often has become a spokesperson, asked to speak for the community in a number of different ways. So she was asked not so long ago to get the Afghan women to put some Afghan food on for a local wine and cheese festival. And this may not be what you'd think Muslim families would be preparing their local Afghan food for, but it was a fantastic opportunity. She got these Afghan women together, they sold their food, the women came up and talked to them. A couple of these Afghan women could speak English and no doubt talked about what did you put in the food, how did you cook it. It was a tremendous way for the local community to see the Afghans actually a part of a really important social event in the community. What was particularly outstanding about this example was that Fatima and these local Afghan women then took the proceeds, and they probably could have done with some of the profit for their own families, and donated it to the local hospital as a community was in a fundraising mode to buy a CT CAT scan. And this actually made it into the local country newspaper. But she displayed resilience across difference. Peter is a landscaper and a member of the local council who I've developed a relationship with over 2 years. And Peter is one of these people, who has fears and concerns about new migrants, about these Afghans, about these Muslims, but wants to be open. And I think this is reflective of a lot of people in rural communities who maybe are not very against, but they're not sure about it. And Peter's had a mixed experience, and one of them, unfortunately, was after talking with him, he made this commitment: David, I am going to either go into an Afghan house or invite one to my own. And on another visit, he said to me, David, I'm really sorry. In between our visits, we had these images of these young Australian Muslims fighting with ISIS, and a particular image of an Australian Muslim with severed heads in his hand that made it across the media, and all he could see was these Muslims in his community, and he couldn't follow through with it. But Peter showed resilience also in reaching out. So there's this kind of ambiguity about how do I deal with my fear and my uncomfortability with difference and with religious difference, but how do I show hospitality and welcome? And I've seen Peter walk through this, and I think Peter's a great example of what a lot of rural communities trying to deal with fears and uncertainties and yet wanting to be welcome. And in this case with Peter, he actually was a landscaper and did some work for an Afghan who didn't pay him for months. And Peter was getting particularly upset with this Afghan who, in fact, at one point claimed to him they got a pair of scissors and said to Peter, I did it myself, Peter. You didn't cut my lawn. I did it with my own scissors. This didn't go down too well with Peter. And he was telling me he was just furious and had decided he will have nothing whatsoever to do with this particular Afghan. And of course, you generalize across the Afghan Hazara community. But on another stage, he came back to me and he said, David, let me tell you the end of the story. One day, after I'd had a final confrontation, this Afghan came to me, opened the door, and gave me this huge bear hug. And he said, Peter, I'm so sorry. He said, here's the money that I owe you. I'm really sorry for my behavior with you. And Peter told me, he said, my heart melted. He said, I knew that whatever kind of feelings and antagonism I had, I couldn't hold them back. And I knew that I would still be able to reach out to this person. Resilience. It's not an easy thing. And one of the things about working with diversity in rural communities is, like it is in urban communities, it's messy. It gets uncomfortable. But finding ways to build resilience is really important in being able to bridge difference. And whether it's a structural transversal enabler or everyday transversal enabler, it's the everyday ways in which rural communities can find ways to move forward. Amin quotes Grand when he says, we must come to processes of learning how to collaborate, how to be together, both in our differences and in our community. There's work to be done in which we hold the cultural differences in community and communication as both basic problematics to be worked out and as opportunities for enrichment. Groups and communities coming together can be seen as places for emergence, creation, and transformation. And I think this kind of growing diversity in rural communities, and some of these examples that I've tried to give show that they are problematics. It's not always easy to work through differences, but they are at the same time opportunities for enrichment for both communities. And these are kind of some of the challenges that this particular rural community are going through. There's no end to it, but certainly as this last quote suggests, there are challenges and there have been really positive opportunities as this community continues to work through some of these transitions. Thank you.
Hi, not quite sure. Michael?
Yeah, I'm here.
Shall I stop share screen or?
I think on the last, did you have another slide, David, that had your contact information?
Yes, sorry, there is one more slide. Where are we?
Oops. No.
Perfect.
It can be seen.
Can you see that? Or?
Yeah.
For those who might be interested, this presentation is partly from a recently published article in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies called Everyday Otherness, Intercultural Refugee Encounters and Everyday Multiculturalism in a South Australian Rural Town. The link to that and my own contact details for anybody who perhaps would like to contact me further.
Yeah, that's great. So I was thinking actually, Philomena, if we could just leave that screen up for a little bit so that if people want to jot down that information that we could. And while we wait for some questions to come in, I actually had a question if I could just pose it verbally instead of typing it in. David, I was actually born in Australia and raised in Canada. And I went back to Australia in 95, 96. And at the time, I recall that the Australian government used to have a white-only policy as far as immigration was concerned. And I think when I was there in 96, they were celebrating that they were getting rid of that policy, obviously, for good reasons. And I was wondering, since the 90s then, and I noticed it when I was there in the 90s, that the idea of what is Australian was still very prominent, of course, then, and what you've mentioned kind of fits with what I observed. But has there been anything, because there was a change in policy in immigration, to encourage, or programs to encourage at least some mixing of cultures, or to help, or are there services that help with that to ease, potential cultural differences, or things or examples that can be used? Maybe not. Do you have any good examples in Australia that can perhaps be used in Canada and elsewhere?
Certainly, I think in the 1970s, the Australian government officially made decisions to turn away from that White Australia policy. And over the following decades, up until the 90s, when you were obviously visiting Australia again, they certainly began to move towards some policies of supporting multiculturalism, which some of those policies were aimed at strengthening ethnic associations, amongst other things, so that you would have supporting processes for that. Now, things have changed somewhat around that. I'm not sure, there's no particular programs, I think, at the moment that the Australian government is pushing in terms of facilitating those kind of multicultural dynamics. It's tending to be more unofficial rather than official, so that people live and move in community, and hopefully they get along. There are particular multicultural days and events that are promoted by particularly state governments that try to highlight ethnic diversity and the positive aspects of those kinds of challenges. But there are not many programs that actually are actively engaged in promoting ways in which people can engage culturally, other than specific events that particular communities have, or particular days in which they might celebrate ethnic diversity.
Okay, that's very good.
Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, so I have some questions.
Yeah.
Okay, from Linamar. And Linamar sort of asked the question, other than those initiatives that these transversal enablers promote, are there specific programs or actions promoted by the municipal, I can't pronounce it now, or provincial governments to sensitize rural inhabitants? These are all linked questions. The other one is, are there any success stories you could share coming out of public libraries, and how do you prepare communities to receive refugees, for example? So,
okay. In terms of programs or actions by municipal or provincial governments to sensitize, I don't think there are particular programs that are actually set up by governments, municipal or local. What you do have in this, for instance, in this country town, is the local mayor facilitating and positively providing leadership for the community in promoting events that support diversity in the community. So there are there's a week called Refugee Week. There's a day called Harmony Day when it's supposed to promote events, and the local council will go out of their way with members of the local community to actually sponsor events and opportunities to promote the kind of diversity. One of the other things that they've done is that provided public forums where there have been concerns. One of the concerns in this country town is that some local long-term residents have blamed the local council, saying, you are bringing these people in. Who is paying you to take these newcomers in? How are they? And all of kind of rumors about all the kind of mobile phones and special benefits that they are getting that others aren't getting in the community. And so what the local government has done is provide forums for the local community to interact with them, to talk about how the new migrants are coming in and the support that is there for them, and trying to deal with some of the negative or rumors that that people had that were not true, and trying to help promote information for them. Libraries have been interesting because there have been places where members of different migrant communities particularly have access to computer and Wi-Fi, and there have been bridging opportunities for migrants to connect with their family and needs that they have where perhaps they wouldn't have access to. I haven't done a lot of work with public libraries, but that certainly has been a public space that's been really important for some who don't either have the computers themselves or that opportunity. Preparing communities to receive refugees. That is an important question, and part of that, as I kind of mentioned earlier in the presentation, is the importance for local government authorities to begin communicating and networking within their own communities about what it means to have refugees in their community, and to facilitate and encourage the kinds of support that are needed. Obviously, housing, English as kids come into schools, and all of those kinds of challenges, finding ways to liaise with particular schools that are going to take these refugees, and some of the particular needs they have are really important. And particularly in those environments, finding ways to communicate, I think, with families about some of the challenges that they would have.
Okay, so there is a fourth question. We don't know who it is from, but it says, thanks for the areas mentioned in which there are attempts to bridge the multicultural dynamics in Australia. However, I was wondering, in relation to employment in the community, is there a quota system being considered, or is there one in place to help include minority in the government sector jobs and so on? So sort of positive.
I don't know of a quota system in place. particularly in relationship for government sector jobs. I can't speak to that. I don't.
Well, I wonder whether I may sort of say something, because it's interesting, listening to David and his kind of exploration of how this happens and how the encounters between refugees, if you like, and local communities happens, because that was going to be one of my questions was, well, if there's a sort of policy where some towns decide, are allocated the status of having refugees, then is there any central government or federal government funding available? But that doesn't seem to be the case. Is that right?
Maybe I can just respond. Yeah. No, there is some funding.
Right.
So the particular town that I was looking at wasn't one of these places. Okay. So it happened organically. There were a few Hazara that were there. They found work. They said to some other Hazara, look, why don't you come down? Or this is a safe town. People get along. Why don't you come down? Or they've got family, these kind of connections. There is another bigger town where there was a lot more resources set aside for helping, because these were places the government was facilitating Congolese, Burmese, Myanmar refugees. Yeah. Now, because of the community grew in this particular town, the government has recognized the need to provide resources. And so they're funding for what's called a Australian Migrant Resource Centre, which are those who are actually to help facilitate the needs, particularly of humanitarian migrants in the town. And so there has been some funding that has come in for that. And that's been a very, one of the reasons why there has been things have working reasonably well in the community because of the resource that has come in. Certainly much more difficult when those resources aren't there.
Because and there might be Canadians who would like to share their experiences in Canada, because I know it works quite differently in Canada. But I can relate to David's experience of the more informal arrangements. For example, at the moment, the UK government has, decided to accept a limited number of Syrian refugees, basically based in camps in the Middle East. And we have some settled, about 18 families or so settled in the Highlands, in the Highland region of Scotland. And in fact, there aren't any resources. And I was explaining this to David, they're being housed in what we called hard to let areas. So in social housing that actually local people don't want. So the places are stigmatized. And in fact, they're relying on mainly volunteers to provide English language resources and so on. So it's interesting. So it'd be interesting to hear. Okay, so we have some comments from Canada here. Canada has ongoing issues over reconciliation and accommodation with its Aboriginal people. Some of these issues are similar to the Australian Aboriginal issues. How would you accommodate these issues concurrently with the issues of incoming refugees, in your case with the Hazara migrants from Afghanistan? So very interesting question. Thank you. That was from Gus.
Well, thanks, Gus, for asking an easy question. There are lots of similarities, from what I understand, with issues with Canada and Australia, and both are important. And Australia is still grappling quite deeply with issues of Australian Indigenous communities and how they will accommodate and work with them both within kind of formal town situations and in where Indigenous communities live in their own communities. And look, both are important and both have to be worked at concurrently, as you've indicated with this. One of the areas that I particularly have of interest, which I can't speak to, is the ways in which Indigenous communities respond and engage with newer migrant communities, and how what are the ways of, you know, if you will, conflict and conviviality, the ways in which there are tensions and the ways in which actually there are a positive sense of getting along, and perhaps that they understand more of the challenges of some of these newer communities in country towns. So I don't really have answers to your question, other than the fact that yes, they need to be looked at certainly concurrently.
The next question is from M. Lewis John. I know in Canada there are many opportunities for minority diversity to be included and selected for government jobs. This is a means by which the government helps to bridge the gap and to promote inclusiveness. Certainly, we do not have that in the United Kingdom. And in fact, I'm not sure at the moment that the refugees that they've accepted have the right to work even, because their refugee status might not be completely settled, or they might have a limited leave to remain. But I know that in much of Europe, where the Syrian refugees are being, I shouldn't say housed, detained is probably the right word, they certainly reckon that it's going to take a few years to process the applications for refugee status. So, you know, there are mixed views depending on where you are. I think it's a bit of a struggle, but I don't know what happens in Australia.
Yeah, look, as far as I know, that there are no quotas like perhaps you have in Canada, either for diversity. I think there's talk about the need to be more inclusive, but I don't think there are any quotas for that. And certainly with our refugees, those who have a bridging visa, more recently, those who didn't have work rights now are beginning to have work rights without but they are not being given hope that they have opportunity for permanent residency. It's a temporary kind of arrangement, but at least they're able to find some form of work. It's likely that it would be low income, low skills kinds of work. But again, there's no quota, which is interesting what's happened in Canada, given I know that Canada particularly has taken on quite significant numbers, as we're talking about refugees, of Syrians more recently.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the issue of quotas in the context of equality legislation and so on is hugely controversial in the UK, and it's even more uncertain in our times at the moment. It's just a no-go area for conversation somehow. Yeah, it's interesting.
There's government policy and there's local community response. And I think one of the things that I've seen in this rural community has been both the importance of structural responses and resources and the way that local communities respond often in volunteer ways. And this has been really important. The people have gone out of their way to support and reach out to these new communities, and finding ways to support, whether through policy or other ways that encourage both structural and volunteer responses, I think will be really important in finding a kind of cohesive, positive ways. And certainly the focus of my research is the fact that these changes are happening in rural communities. These diverse communities, whether they're refugees or others, are going to be a part of the social or ethnic landscape. And the quicker these communities can adjust and find ways to move forward, the quicker the benefit, both socially, culturally, and economically for these communities.
Yeah. Okay, so the Emilus John, again, that there needs to be implementation targets. It's a comment instead of just talks of other policies are not getting minorities out of the situation they're in for job security. Yeah, I don't know. I absolutely agree. And I mean, I think one of the issues that's probably for example, with the Syrian refugees, at least in Scotland or in the rural area that I'm from, they don't even have access to a secure funding for English language provision. So, you know, if you're thinking of actually getting them into jobs, if most of them cannot speak English, then they're not even going to get into work, even if they had the right to work. So I think there are real issues around the funding of such provision. And there is some reliance on voluntary workers, but, you know, it's not a very sustainable way to encourage people to be included in the job market or anything else. Linamar, again, on the same vein, is it possible to be funded as an NGO or non-profit to work specifically with newcomers? Do they exist in these rural communities?
I think there are. Is it possible to be funded? Well, it probably is possible, but whether the government has particular models for how they fund and who they fund, and there tend to be particular agencies that community providers that bid in cycles for how they're going to provide services for newcomers. And so a year or so ago, this kind of went through again, and some providers, you know, won the kind of funding for the government for welcoming, for helping with housing, or the support with the English language. And there is actually in Australia a certain number of hours. I think it might be 500 hours that they get some kind of funding for. And there are other groups, for instance, like Rotary in local communities that provide services. Sometimes local churches provide opportunities for English language classes, or other ways in which they try to support these local communities. One of the interesting things, this is not referring to the Hazara, but for instance, with Filipino and Korean migrants that are coming into these country towns, is that there is some kind of religious association. Many of the Filipinos are Catholic background and have become involved with the local Catholic community, and that's been really helpful for them. And Koreans, many of them are Presbyterian and have engaged with the local Presbyterian church. And in saying that, there have been some church communities that have reached out across these, including Afghan Hazara, and volunteered in a number of different ways, although there is no particular affiliation for that. But yes, I think there is opportunity for NGO-related non-profit groups to be engaged.
I think, I mean, it's an interesting question as well, because one of the ongoing issues, at least in the context of the UK, and it's not just a rural issue, but generally, is the precarious nature of funding that NGOs have. So, you know, there's one of the arguments that has been made often is that the NGOs are dependent on government funding, which might be very short term and very poorly funded. And so I know that a lot of NGOs are not able to sustain their provision because there's no security of funding. And perhaps with the austerity measures that have been implemented in Europe, in fact, much of the provision was very much dependent on NGOs. That's being lost as well. So sometimes there's a struggle to maintain that provision. And I know a lot of groups that deal with migrants and minority ethnic groups, as we call them, have been complaining for quite a long time about the challenges they face in actually providing services for minorities and migrants. I think there's a real, it's not seen as a sustainable way of actually addressing the issues. So I don't know, the cultures I think are very different. It's interesting. And, you know, for, you know, one of the things that occurred to me, and I don't know if this is happening in Canada, but someone raised the issue of libraries, and public libraries certainly have been a very important way for migrants, refugees to access the internet, and has been a good public space. But as rural communities are faced with cuts in public expenditure, a lot of these rural spaces have been disappearing. In fact, you know, the UK and in some parts of the UK, people are struggling to keep public libraries open that are publicly funded. So I don't know if that's happening in Canada, but you know, there's another rural space, you know, when we're talking about specifically rural issues, that's disappearing because of lack of funding from local governments, because they feel that their funding is being cut and they can't sustain that provision. So, you know, that obviously will have another impact on where migrants and minorities can access their social spaces, which is an interesting issue.
Yeah, so I think as well as NGOs, as I mentioned, there are other community groups. And I think there are definitely spaces for groups like Rotary and other community groups to have other alternatives funded sources or provisions or ways of trying to include and be involved in supporting newcomers. I mean, funding is obviously a very difficult question.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments that anyone out there would like to make? Or even some comments about what's happening in Canada and the experiences you might have of accepting refugees in rural areas. Be interesting to hear.
Well, if there's no question, I mean, I wouldn't mind, even if somebody has a brief comment, is it true also in Canada that rural areas are becoming increasingly diverse, as it's increasingly happening in different places in Australia?
Just trying to mind, okay. So, Lenamar, you were saying that you live in a city with 120,000 inhabitants. We can consider it rural. Okay. Do you want to say something about what's happening there? I don't know if you could be enabled to speak, but so most of the refugees are being sent. You have the city you're talking about has most of the refugees being sent to Quebec. Interesting. Oh, there you are. If you unmute you, or maybe Michael has to do it. I don't know. Lenamar, can you unmute your?
Are there resources being provided for refugees by the government?
She just seems frozen for the moment. I've promoted her, but I can't seem to get her microphone unmuted. Just must be the internet connection there. Just must be a little lag.
We had a little blip, but it didn't last very long. It was
No, yeah. That's the beauty of internet service. Well, if I could actually maybe suggest, because I do appreciate David's email addresses there, and perhaps if you just want to stop share screen, and maybe we can wrap it up. Does that sound okay, Phil?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, we've had a good amount of time.
Yeah, it's been good.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for participating and for asking the questions. It's great that, you know, it would be lovely to have more of a dialogue, but I'm sure David would be happy if you contacted him as well directly, and it'll be you can engage with the Rural Policy Migration Theme Group, and we can have a discussion on refugees in rural communities. It seems to be an issue that we all share across Canada and Europe and Australia. So that would be very interesting anyway, to facilitate some discussion further beyond this.
I particularly enjoyed the 3 different continent perspectives. So I too would like to thank everyone for their comments. It's definitely a very interesting session. Thanks, Philomena, to yourself and the migration team, and of course, Highlands and Highlands College in Inverness for bringing David there today. It's great to have your institution part of the RPLC network, and encourage those who are listening, if you want more information about the RPLC, please visit the website at rplc-capr.ca. You'll notice on the screen there we have a conference coming up next week, which is in Guelph, Ontario, with a variety of topics on informing rural policy and mobilizing knowledge. So those who are able to attend, please, I look forward to seeing you there. If anyone wants more information about the RPLC, this is my contact information as well. Just email me, blatherwickem@brandonu.ca. We will actually hopefully have a couple sessions broadcast from Guelph on rural policy issues, probably on Facebook Live and also using Periscope. For more information, please email me and I will send you details on the topics. For those who are on our email list, I believe you actually got a list of sessions that we plan on covering. And if you're not on our email list, please sign up to be on our list for upcoming webinars. We also do have one on October 25th, which is on the reconciliation process and looking at Indigenous communities as a source of problem solvers, so proactive approaches to rebuilding communities. We have a great author that we have coming up on October 25th. And as well, thank you for everyone for attending today. As I mentioned, we will put the video up on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending you a survey, also just a short 10-question survey. Please give us your feedback on today's webinar so that we can improve on our process. So thanks again, Philomena. If that's good, we'll end recording, and we'll see everyone next time. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you to David as well. Okay.